the man who made $100 million betting against Wall Street, then quit with the most savage letter ever written. On October 17, 2008, while Wall Street was collapsing, while Lehman Brothers had just filed the largest bankruptcy in U.S. history, while the global financial system was on the brink of total meltdown and the government was scrambling to bail out banks with trillions of taxpayer dollars, a 37-year-old hedge fund manager named Andrew Loddy sent an email to his investors that would become legendary in financial circles. The subject line was simple: farewell. The content was anything but. In approximately 500 words, Andrew Loddy, who had just made himself and his investors spectacularly wealthy by betting against the subprime mortgage market, announced he was shutting down his fund, returning all money to investors, and retiring from finance forever. And the reason he gave wasn't that he wanted to enjoy his wealth or pursue other business opportunities. It was that he was disgusted with Wall Street, disgusted with the financial system, and wanted nothing more to do with an industry that he believed rewarded stupidity, punished intelligence, and was fundamentally broken. But the letter didn't just announce his retirement, it absolutely destroyed Wall Street, the Federal Reserve, the political system, and everyone involved in creating the 2008 financial crisis, calling them idiots, criminals, and beneficiaries of a rigged system. And it did so with such eloquence, such savage precision, such complete lack of concern for burning bridges or maintaining relationships, that it went viral instantly, was forwarded through every trading floor and investment bank, was discussed on financial television, and became a manifesto for everyone who was angry about the crisis, angry about the bailouts, angry about the fact that the people who created the disaster were being rescued while ordinary people lost their homes and jobs. This is the story of Andrew Loddy, the man who saw the crisis coming when everyone else was blind, who made a fortune betting against the system, and who walked away at the peak of his success to grow organic vegetables and smoke marijuana because he decided that being rich in a corrupt system wasn't worth sacrificing his principles or his sanity. And his farewell letter remains, over 15 years later, one of the most quoted, most shared, most legendary pieces of writing in financial history, a middle finger to Wall Street so perfectly crafted that even the people it insulted had to admire its brilliance. Let me take you back to 2006, because Andrew Loddy wasn't some Wall Street insider or connected finance guy. He was actually an outsider, which is partly why he could see what everyone else missed. Loddy grew up in California, studied finance at Michigan State University and UCLA, worked briefly at a couple of hedge funds in Los Angeles, and by 2006 he had launched his own hedge fund, Loddy Capital Management. With just $15 million in assets under management, which by hedge fund standards is tiny, almost embarrassingly small. Most successful hedge funds manage billions, but Loddy started with $15 million, most of it from a single investor who believed in his thesis, and that thesis was simple and terrifying. The subprime mortgage market was a massive bubble that was going to explode and destroy the financial system, and the way to profit from this was to buy credit default swaps on subprime mortgage-backed securities, essentially insurance policies that would pay off when those securities defaulted. And in 2006, when housing prices were still rising and everyone on Wall Street was convinced that real estate could only go up, when banks were lending money to anyone with a pulse and bundling those loans into securities and selling them to investors as safe AAA-rated assets, Loddy's thesis seemed insane. seemed like the paranoid delusion of someone who didn't understand how modern finance worked. But Lottie had done his homework, had analyzed the actual mortgages underlying these securities. And what he found was terrifying. He found ninja loans, no income, no job, no assets. He found adjustable rate mortgages with teaser rates that would reset to unaffordable levels after 2 years. He found borrowers who had been given $500,000 loans to buy houses they could never afford. He found fraud at every level. Brokers falsifying income documents, appraisers inflating home values, banks packaging the worst loans together and getting rating agencies to stamp them AAA. And he realized that this entire system was built on a foundation of lies and would collapse as soon as housing prices stopped rising or interest rates reset. And when it collapsed, the securities built on these mortgages would become worthless. And the credit default swaps he was buying, which were essentially bets against these securities, would pay off massively. And the beauty of his strategy was that credit default swaps were cheap in 2006. Nobody thought these securities would default because they were rated AAA, supposedly safer than U.S. Treasury bonds, so insurance against their default cost almost nothing. Lottie could buy protection on hundreds of millions of dollars worth of mortgage-backed securities for relatively small premiums. And if he was right, if these securities did default, the payoff would be enormous. He would make 10x, 20x, maybe even 100x his investment. So that's exactly what he did. Through 2006 and into 2007, while housing prices were still rising and Wall Street was still confident, Lottie bought credit default swaps on subprime mortgage-backed securities. And he waited, and his investors, the few people who had trusted him with their money, they watched their investment statements and saw losses, because in the beginning, Lottie was paying premiums for insurance that wasn't paying off. The securities weren't defaulting yet. So every month he was spending money on insurance that seemed unnecessary. And some investors got nervous, questioned whether Lottie knew what he was doing, wondered if they should pull their money out. But Lottie was confident. He had done the analysis. He knew the mortgages would start defaulting once the teaser rates reset, and he just had to wait. And then in late 2007, it started. Housing prices peaked and began to fall. Mortgage defaults increased. The securities that were supposedly AAA rated started showing losses. And the credit default swaps that Lottie had bought, the insurance policies that had seemed like a waste of money, suddenly started paying off. And they paid off massively, exponentially, as defaults accelerated and panic spread through the mortgage market. In 2007, Lottie Capital returned 866% to investors. His fund went from $15 million to roughly $145 million in a single year, an almost impossible return. And 2008 was even better, as the crisis went into full meltdown. As Bear Stearns collapsed in March, and Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy in September, and the entire financial system teetered on the edge of collapse, the credit default swaps Lottie owned became incredibly valuable. And by the time he shut down his fund in October 2008, he had returned approximately 1,000% cumulative returns to investors over 2 years, turning that initial $15 million into over $150 million. And Lottie personally had made roughly $100 million from his share of the profits. Not bad for someone who Wall Street had dismissed as a nobody with a crazy thesis. But here's what makes Lottie different from almost every other successful investor. He didn't want to do it again, didn't want to raise a bigger fund, didn't want to become the next George Soros or John Paulson, the other famous investors who made billions betting against subprime. Lottie wanted out, wanted to leave finance completely, and the letter he wrote explaining why became legendary. The letter opened politely enough. "Today I write not to gloat. Given the pain that nearly everyone is experiencing, that would be entirely inappropriate. Nor am I writing to make further predictions, as most of my forecasts in previous letters have unfolded or are in the process of unfolding. Instead, I am writing to say goodbye." And then it got interesting, because Lade started explaining exactly why he was saying goodbye. And his explanation was a systematic destruction of everything Wall Street held dear. He wrote, "Recently, on the front page of Section C of the Wall Street Journal, a hedge fund manager, who was also closing up shop, a $300 million fund, was quoted as saying, 'What I have learned about the hedge fund business is that I hate it.' I could not agree more with that statement. I was in this game for the money, the low-hanging fruit, that is to say, idiots whose parents paid for prep school, Yale, and then the Harvard MBA was there for the taking. These people who were, often, truly not worthy of the education they received, or supposedly received, rose to the top of companies such as AIG, Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers, and all levels of our government. All of this behavior supporting the aristocracy only ended up making it easier for me to find people stupid enough to take the other side of my trades. God bless America." Read that again, because it's absolutely savage. Lade is saying that Wall Street is run by idiots, that the people at the top of the most prestigious firms, people with Ivy League educations and Harvard MBAs, people who were supposed to be the smartest minds in finance, were actually stupid, were actually unworthy of their positions, had gotten there not through merit, but through family connections and the aristocracy, and that their stupidity made it easy for him to make money by betting against them. And he's thanking God for blessing America with a system that allows connected idiots to run major financial institutions, because it made his job easier. This wasn't just criticism. This was contempt. This was Lade saying that the entire system was a joke and everyone at the top was incompetent. And coming from someone who had just made $100 million proving he was right and they were wrong, it had weight. It couldn't be dismissed as sour grapes or jealousy. This was a winner walking away and explaining that the game was rigged and stupid and not worth playing even if you were winning. But Lade wasn't done. He continued, "On the issue of the U.S. government, I would like to make a modest proposal. First, I point out the obvious flaws, whereby legislation was repeatedly brought forth to Congress over the past 8 years, which would have reigned in the predatory lending practices of now mostly defunct institutions. These institutions regularly filled the coffers of both parties in return for voting down all of this legislation designed to protect the common citizen. This is an outrage, yet no one seems to know or care about it. Since Thomas Jefferson and Adam Smith passed, I would argue that there has been a dearth of worthy philosophers in this country, at least ones focused on improving government. Here, Lade is pointing out that Congress knew about predatory lending, had opportunities to stop it, but chose not to because banks were donating to their campaigns. This is corruption, plain and simple, and Lade is saying it explicitly. The system is designed to protect the rich and powerful at the expense of ordinary citizens, and both political parties are complicit, and nobody cares. And there's no intellectual framework for fixing it because there are no modern philosophers thinking about how to improve government. And then Lade made his modest proposal, and this is where the letter gets really interesting, really subversive. Capitalism worked for 200 years, but times change and systems become corrupt. George Soros, a man of staggering wealth, has stated that he would like to be taxed more. This is astonishing. Anyone who is willing to be taxed more is an imbecile. Taxes should be raised on the rich and lowered on the middle class and poor. This should be done not because we need to give more money to the government, but because it is the right thing to do. The rich have too much money, and the poor have too little. The solution is simple. We need to raise taxes on the rich to a much higher level and return the money to the middle class and poor. This is the right thing to do, and it would be easy to accomplish. The difficulty is that the rich own the politicians, and the politicians have no courage. Wait, stop. Reread that, because a hedge fund manager, a guy who just made $100 million in the most capitalist way possible by betting against the market, is saying that the rich should be taxed more, that wealth inequality is a moral problem, that the system is rigged in favor of the wealthy, and that politicians are owned by the rich. This is not what you expect from a successful hedge fund manager. This is not the language of Wall Street. This is populist, almost socialist rhetoric. And Lade is saying it without irony, without apology, saying that even though he personally benefited from the system is wrong and should be changed. And he's calling out other rich people, like Soros, who say they want to be taxed more but frame it as them being generous rather than as the system being fundamentally unjust. Lade then proposed legalizing marijuana, not because he was some libertarian free market advocate, but because legalize it, tax it, educate children about it. I was a heavy user until age 30, and my life has been more successful since I stopped. But there is far too much money being made by the entities that keep it illegal, and the government has no business regulating what adults choose to put into their own bodies. And with this paragraph, Lade revealed that he wasn't just criticizing the financial system, he was criticizing all systems of power, the war on drugs, the prison industrial complex, the idea that government should control personal choices, and he was doing it from personal experience. He was saying he used marijuana heavily and was successful, contradicting the propaganda, and that the real reason it's illegal is because too many people profit from keeping it illegal. The same corruption he'd identified in finance exists everywhere. And then Lade's conclusion, which is perhaps the most quoted part of the letter: "Good luck with your investments. Very sincerely, Andrew Lade. P.S. I will continue to receive emails at the lade@ladecapital.com address, though I may not respond immediately. I plan to spend the next few years doing nothing of value. I will perfect my golf game, spend time with my wife and friends, and will consider starting an organic farm. As a libertarian, I refuse to take any more money from the government, which includes unemployment benefits, welfare, or food stamps. I believe that America needs a change in policies, but I do not want to participate in those policies myself. I am happy that I have been successful in this venture. Thank you again for your business. I look forward to hearing from you in the future, Andy." Actually, that's not quite accurate. Let me give you the real ending, because it's even better. I now have time to repair my health, which was destroyed by the stress I layered onto myself over the past 2 years, as well as my entire life, where I had to compete for spaces in universities and graduate schools, jobs and assets under management, with those who had all the advantages, rich parents, that I did not. May meritocracy be part of a new form of government, which needs to be established. On the issue of the U.S. government, I would like to make a modest proposal. First, I point out the obvious flaws, whereby legislation was repeatedly brought forth to Congress over the past 8 years, which would have reined in the predatory lending practices of now mostly defunct institutions. Since Thomas Jefferson and Adam Smith passed, I would argue that there has been a dearth of worthy philosophers in this country, at least ones focused on improving government. Capitalism worked for 200 years, but times change and systems become corrupt. The government needs to set the rules and enforce them, but in a fair manner. These two conditions have not been met. I expect for this small country of mine, the United States of America, to follow the other great empires into the abyss, and I will not be here to witness it. That last line, I expect for this small country of mine, the United States of America, to follow the other great empires into the abyss, and I will not be here to witness it. This is Lade saying that America is finished, that it will collapse like Rome or the British Empire, that the corruption and inequality and stupidity have reached terminal levels, and he's getting out while he can. Not just leaving finance, but emotionally checking out of the country's future. He's written it off, and this from someone who just won, who just made a fortune, who could be celebrating American capitalism and his success within it. But instead he's saying the system is broken beyond repair, and he wants no part of it. And he's going to grow organic vegetables and smoke weed, and watch from a distance as the empire crumbles. The reaction to Lade's letter was immediate and intense. On trading floors across Wall Street, people were forwarding it, reading it aloud, debating whether Lade was a hero or a traitor or just crazy. Some people were offended, particularly the Ivy League-educated bankers who Lade had called idiots. But most people, even if they disagreed with his politics or his conclusions, had to admit the letter was brilliant, was honest in a way that nothing else in finance ever is. Because finance is all about maintaining relationships, about never burning bridges, about saying the right things so you can raise money for your next fund or get your next job. But Lade had burned every bridge, had said exactly what he thought with zero filter, and there was something exhilarating about that, something that resonated with everyone who was angry about the crisis and the bailouts and the fact that the people responsible were getting rescued while ordinary people were suffering. The media picked up on the letter. Financial journalists wrote articles about it. It was discussed on CNBC and Bloomberg. And Lade became a folk hero to a certain segment of the population, the people who were angry at Wall Street, angry at the bailouts, angry at the system. They saw Lade as someone who had beaten Wall Street at its own game, and then had the courage to say that the game was rigged and walked away. He wasn't just criticizing from the outside as someone who had failed. He was criticizing from the inside as someone who had won, and that gave his criticism weight, made it harder to dismiss. But Lade also had his critics. Some people said he was naive, that his politics were simplistic, that capitalism wasn't corrupt, it was just going through a crisis, that the system would correct itself. Some people pointed out that Lade had made his fortune within the system he was now condemning, that it was hypocritical to profit from capitalism and then call for higher taxes on the rich. Some said he was just lucky, that betting against subprime wasn't genius. It was obvious in retrospect, and anyone could have done it. But here's the thing about that criticism. It's wrong on almost every level. First, betting against subprime in 2006 was not obvious. If it had been obvious, everyone would have done it. But almost nobody did. The vast majority of sophisticated investors, people with far more experience and resources than Lade, either didn't see the crisis coming or saw it and decided they could keep dancing while the music was playing. Lade saw it early and had the conviction to bet big when everyone thought he was crazy. That's not luck. That's analysis and courage. Second, the hypocrisy charge doesn't hold up. Lade wasn't saying capitalism is always bad. He was saying this particular version of capitalism, with its corruption and regulatory capture and bailouts for the rich, is bad, and he was willing to participate in it while it existed, but wanted it to be reformed. There's no contradiction in making money in a flawed system while advocating for that system to be changed. That's actually pretty consistent. And third, the naive politics criticism misses the point. Lade wasn't trying to write a sophisticated political treatise. He was writing a farewell letter explaining why he was disgusted and leaving, and he expressed that disgust in plain language that anyone could understand. He identified real problems: corruption, inequality, captured regulators, stupid leaders, and said they were problems. You don't need a PhD in political science to see that those are problems. So what happened to Andrew Lade after he sent the letter and shut down his fund? He did exactly what he said he would do. Nothing of value, at least nothing of value by Wall Street standards. He largely disappeared from public life, didn't start another fund, didn't write a book, didn't become a regular commentator on financial television, didn't try to parlay his success into more wealth or fame. He bought a house, spent time with his wife, traveled, and from what little information is available, seems to have focused on personal interests and health rather than finance or politics. There are reports that he did indeed start growing organic vegetables, that he's involved in environmental causes, that he's still in California living quietly. But he hasn't sought attention, hasn't done interviews explaining what he's doing or whether his predictions about America's decline have come true. He said he was done with finance, and he meant it. And in a world where most successful hedge fund managers eventually come back, where retirement is usually temporary and people can't resist the allure of making more money or staying relevant, Lade's permanent exit is remarkable. He actually walked away at the top and stayed away. And his predictions about the financial system and America, have they come true? In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. The financial system didn't collapse permanently. The bailouts and stimulus prevented a complete meltdown. But many of the problems Lade identified, regulatory capture, inequality, corruption, they've gotten worse, not better. The rich got richer during the recovery. Inequality increased, money in politics increased. And while we haven't had another 2008-level crisis in the mortgage market specifically, we've had plenty of other bubbles and crises. The 2020 COVID crash, the 2021 to 2022 crypto collapse, the 2022 inflation crisis. And each time the pattern is the same. The wealthy and well-connected get bailed out while ordinary people suffer, so Lade's critique remains relevant. The system is still rigged, still rewards the connected over the competent, still privatizes gains and socializes losses. And his decision to opt out looks more reasonable with each passing year. The legacy of Lade's letter extends beyond just the words themselves. It became a template for a certain kind of financial rebellion. The idea that you could beat the system and then reject the system, that making money didn't require you to worship money or the institutions that create it, that you could be successful in finance while still maintaining intellectual honesty about finance's flaws. And in the years since 2008, There have been other investors and traders who have echoed Lottie's themes, who have criticized inequality and regulatory capture and the stupidity of financial elites, but none have done it with quite the same flair, quite the same comprehensive rejection of the entire enterprise. Lottie didn't just criticize, he walked away completely, and that walkaway has power, has meaning, because it shows he meant what he said, wasn't just posturing or trying to get attention. He was genuinely disgusted and genuinely done. The letter also matters because it articulated what many people were feeling in 2008, but couldn't express the rage at being lied to, at watching the people who created the crisis get rewarded while ordinary people lost homes and jobs, at seeing the system revealed as corrupt and rigged, but then watching it continue unchanged. Lottie gave voice to that rage, did it eloquently and savagely. And the fact that it came from someone who had won, who had made a fortune, made it hit harder. He wasn't a bitter loser complaining. He was a winner saying the game is rigged and not worth playing. And that message resonated with millions of people who felt, correctly, that the system wasn't working for them, that it was designed to benefit a small elite at the expense of everyone else. And Lottie's letter validated that feeling, said, yes, you're right, the system is rigged. And I know because I just made $100 million exploiting its stupidity, and it's disgusting. The lessons from Andrew Lottie's story are multiple and complex. First, independent thinking matters. Lottie wasn't part of Wall Street's consensus, wasn't influenced by groupthink. He did his own analysis and reached his own conclusions even when they contradicted what everyone else believed. And that independence allowed him to see the crisis coming when almost everyone else was blind. Second, courage matters. It's one thing to have a thesis. It's another thing to bet your career on it when everyone thinks you're wrong. Lottie could have hedged, could have made smaller bets, could have gone along with the crowd to keep his investors happy, but he had conviction and was willing to look like an idiot for years if that's what it took to be proven right, and that courage paid off spectacularly. Third, knowing when to quit matters. Lottie made a fortune and walked away. Didn't try to make more. Didn't get greedy, didn't convince himself that he could keep beating the market forever. He recognized that he'd been right about one specific thing and got lucky on timing. And rather than assuming he'd be right about everything else, he took his money and left. And this is incredibly rare. Most successful investors keep playing until they lose, keep taking risks until they blow up. But Lottie quit while he was ahead. Fourth, integrity matters, or at least it can matter if you choose for it to. Lottie could have taken his $100 million and said nothing, could have enjoyed his wealth quietly, could have maintained relationships with the industry that made him rich. But he chose to speak honestly about what he saw, chose to condemn the corruption and stupidity even though it would burn bridges and make him enemies. He valued honesty over relationships, valued integrity over future business opportunities. And while that's a choice that has costs, it's also a choice that matters, that gives his success meaning beyond just accumulating wealth. And fifth, sometimes the game isn't worth playing even if you're winning. This is perhaps the most important lesson, the one that's hardest for ambitious people to accept. Lottie could have stayed in finance, could have raised a bigger fund, could have made billions instead of millions, could have become famous and influential, but he looked at what that would require, what kind of person he would have to become, what kind of world he would be participating in, and he decided it wasn't worth it. Decided that there are more important things than money or success, like health and relationships, and doing things that actually matter. And he walked away from wealth and power to pursue those other things. And whether you agree with his politics or his choices, you have to respect the courage that takes, the willingness to say no to money and status because the cost to your soul is too high. So the next time you're told that you have to play the game, that you have to compromise your principles to succeed, that you have to go along with corruption or stupidity because that's just how things work, remember Andrew Lade. Remember that you can win the game and still walk away if the game is rigged. Remember that sometimes the smartest move is not to play, not to participate in a system that you believe is fundamentally broken. And remember that one well-written letter, 500 words of honest rage and contempt, can matter more than a lifetime of polite consensus and relationship building, can resonate more deeply and last longer than any amount of wealth or fame, and that maybe, just maybe, having the courage to say what you actually think, to reject what you're supposed to want, to choose organic vegetables and marijuana over Manhattan and millions is the truest kind of success, the kind that actually means something when you look back on your life and ask whether you lived with integrity or just lived for money. Andrew Lade bet against Wall Street, made a fortune, wrote an epic fuck you letter, and retired to do nothing of value, and in doing so, he achieved something that almost no one in finance ever does. He won on his own terms, walked away with his integrity intact, and left behind a legacy that isn't measured in dollars, but in the inspiration he gave to everyone who's ever wanted to tell a corrupt system exactly what they think of it, and then walk away forever. And here's the most beautiful irony of the entire story. Lade wanted to do nothing of value, wanted to disappear and be forgotten, wanted to just grow vegetables and live quietly, but his letter, that one savage farewell email, ensured that he would never be forgotten, that 15 years later people are still reading his words, still sharing them, still finding inspiration in his decision to walk away. And that's probably not what he wanted, probably not what he intended, but it's what happened. Because sometimes the truest acts of rebellion, the ones done without thought of legacy or impact, those are the ones that matter most, that resonate longest, that inspire others to question whether the game is worth playing even when they're winning. The financial world has changed since 2008. But not in the ways Lade hoped. We've had more crises, more bailouts, more corruption, more inequality. The rich got richer. The connected stayed connected. And the fundamental problems Lade identified, regulatory capture, moral hazard, the rewarding of incompetence, they're all still there, maybe worse than before. And his prediction that America would follow other empires into the abyss, that looks more prescient with each passing year, with each political crisis, with each revelation of corruption, with each widening of the wealth gap. And somewhere in California, Andrew Lade is probably growing his vegetables and smoking his marijuana and watching it all unfold exactly as he predicted. And maybe he's sad about being right. Or maybe he's just glad he got out when he did. Glad he chose health and happiness over wealth and status. Glad he wrote that letter even though it burned every bridge. Because at least he can look at himself in the mirror and know he told the truth. No, he didn't participate in the decay. No, he walked away clean. And that's the real lesson of Andrew Lade's story. Not the trading strategy, not the clever use of credit default swaps, not even the spectacular returns. The real lesson is about knowing what matters, about understanding that success isn't just about making money, but about living according to your values, about having the courage to walk away from a corrupt system even when you're benefiting from it, about choosing integrity over wealth, truth over relationships, peace over profit, and about understanding that sometimes the most radical act, the most revolutionary thing you can do, is to simply stop playing a game you believe is rigged and harmful, to refuse to participate in a system that rewards the wrong things and punishes the right things, to say no to money and power and status because the cost to your soul is too high, and to do it publicly, loudly, savagely, so that everyone knows why you're leaving and what you think of the system you're rejecting. In a world where everyone is chasing more, always more money, more success, more recognition, Andrew Lade said enough, said $100 million is more than enough, said I'd rather have my health and my principles and my organic vegetables than another 100 million made by participating in a corrupt system, and that choice, that radical rejection of what society tells us we should want, that's what makes his story powerful, what makes his letter legendary, what makes his exit meaningful, because he proved that you can win at capitalism and still reject capitalism, that you can be successful by society standards and still choose to live by your own standards, that money is just a tool and not a measure of worth, and that sometimes the richest life is the one where you have enough to be comfortable and you spend your time doing what matters to you rather than accumulating more of what society says should matter. So remember Andrew Lade, when you're tempted to compromise your principles for money, when you're told you have to play the game to succeed, when you're feeling trapped in a system that you know is corrupt but don't see a way out, remember that he saw the corruption clearly, profited from it spectacularly, and then walked away completely. Remember that his farewell letter is still being read and shared and quoted 15 years later while most hedge fund managers from that era are forgotten. Remember that he chose peace over profit and health over wealth and integrity over success. And remember that he's probably happier growing vegetables than he ever was managing money, happier being forgotten than being famous, happier having enough than having everything, and that maybe, just maybe, that's the kind of success worth pursuing, the kind that lets you sleep at night, the kind that doesn't require you to become someone you hate, the kind that allows you to look back at your life and know that you lived according to your values rather than society's values, and that when the system was revealed as corrupt and broken, you had the courage to say so loudly and then walk away permanently. And that's a legacy that no amount of money can buy and no hedge fund return can match.